Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the 20th century English literature, and specifically the first half of this century, from the end of the reign of Queen Victoria in 1901 to the end of the Second World War in 1945. The 20th century was an age of great change in both literary contents and style. The first years of the century marked the peak of British imperial power, and the reign of Edward VII was accompanied by a consolidation of the nation's economic, industrial, and military fortunes. But then, the First World War destroyed everything. It was evident at that point that the old world of the 19th century would have to give way to the new world, to modernity. Therefore, manifestos, essays, magazines took on the task of sweeping away the literary conventions of the past. Modernism was the name of this vital movement. There was a rejection of everything that had come before, especially from the Victorian age. But these changes, obviously, weren't immediate, and there was first a transitional period with authors like Conrad and Lawrence. Joseph Conrad, with his most famous novella, Heart of Darkness, published in 1902, can be seen as one of the main predecessors of modernism for his original use of the shifting point of view and also for his treatment of time. While the novelist D.H. Lawrence was innovative because he challenged conventions by dealing with new themes. He expressed an extraordinary psychological insight, and in his last novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, published in 1928, he dealt with two of the greatest taboos of the time: sexual relationships and class differences. This novel produced such a scandal that its full version was banned in England until the 60s. So, modernism is the general term which includes all the movements or trends in both literature and all the arts, such as naturalism, symbolism, futurism, imagism, surrealism, and expressionism. So, the new generation of writers that emerged in the second decade of the 20th century is known as modernists. They moved away from the conventional literary form, aiming at giving a more complex vision of man and his world. Modernist novelists weren't interested in representing reality as it was in its completeness and in a realistic or natural way. They saw the task as trying to represent inner life as an uninterrupted flow of thoughts, which they called the stream of consciousness. This was the translation onto the page of the unconscious process of thoughts, associations, and sensations passing through the mind of the character without following a logical or linear pattern. To do these, they used interior monologue as a form of expression, and the emphasis in these novels was therefore on the thoughts of characters and not on their action. In addition, the narrator, who usually represents the link between text and the reader, was often indifferent or neutral, or even invisible. Last, serial publication that was so popular in the Victorian age was no longer necessary because there were more readers and books were cheaper to produce. Then we can pass to two of the most experimental writers of that time, Joyce and Woolf. Joyce's novel Ulysses, published in 1922, was revolutionary for different reasons. First, its narrative form, then its treatment of time, and finally the fact that it took the technique of the stream of consciousness to extremes, expressing the thoughts of the protagonist, Leopold Bloom, but also breaking down them, analyzing them into every minor ramification. The other great experimental writer was Virginia Woolf, who also, like Joyce, used the technique of the stream of consciousness. Her major works were Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, and To the Lighthouse, published in 1927. Finally, Today we're talking about Edward Morgan Foster, who also began to write his novels at the beginning of the 20th century. In his major work, A Passage to India, published in 1924, he gives an in-depth analysis of the social distances existing in India between the ruling English class and the natives, and how this stopped them establishing any real understanding. In fact, the novel begins and also ends with a question: can the English and Indians be friends? And at the end of the novel, the answer appears to be no, not yet.